You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Informality across the world, not just in this region, but across the world, is the norm. And it's really important that we reframe how we think about the informal economy. It's not just, a minority group of workers who experience a huge amount of marginalization. We're talking about a majority of workers who experience a huge amount of marginalization. And that doesn't always get reflected in some of these global discussions.
Hi, I'm Tatiana Maligro, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka. In this episode, we're taking a closer look at the Philippines' informal sector and how the worsening impacts of climate change are putting their livelihoods at risk. When you hear the word informal sector, what jobs come to mind? Maybe it's the taho or buko vendors in parks and public spaces, or perhaps it's the sari-sari store neighbors in our own neighborhoods. You might also think of the delivery riders who are bringing us food orders or online shopping packages, or even the trike and ride-hailing drivers taking us from point A to point B. The informal sector is vast, comprising all kinds of work, and it plays a vital role in the economy. A study from the University of the Philippines estimates that in 2021, around 70% of the Filipino workforce was part of the informal economy. Across Southeast Asia, the numbers are just as staggering. 244 million people, or 78% of ASEAN's workforce, are informal workers. But here's the problem. Informal workers are some of the most vulnerable to economic shocks, health risks, and increasingly, the effects of climate change.
Think about domestic workers working in private homes who are working in close proximity to their employers. They're sort of hidden away and really experience all of the pressures of working really, really long hours, carrying heavy loads, often facing a lot of abuse as well, mental, emotional, sexual, physical abuse, often at the hands of employers and their family members. Think about home-based workers who are, for example, making garments or making kites or, making some form of decoration or clothing in their own homes, but don't necessarily have ventilation or the right furniture and get exposed to all kinds of, respiratory issues, back problems, back pains, joint pains, so there's just such a wide array of risks that workers in the informal economy face, even before we start talking about the climate crisis. And yet, despite being exposed to these risks, the majority of workers in the informal economy remain unprotected in their workplaces.
That was Christy Brand, Workers' Health Coordinator at the Women in Informal Employment Globalizing and Organizing, or WIGO. It's a global network dedicated to supporting informal workers worldwide, with a particular focus on empowering women. She was speaking at a webinar about the impact of climate change on informal workers in Southeast Asia. Christy explained that while many countries, including those in Southeast Asia, have frameworks and policies designed to protect their workforce, these rarely extend to informal workers. She points out the lack of social protections often forces informal workers to fend for themselves. Sila nang bahala maghanap ng paraan to minimize risks to their health or safeguard their livelihoods, much like what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic.
So we know that workers who are informally employed do not have what many would call a standard employment relationship. So, for example, the majority of workers are self-employed. There is no employer in question. And even when some people do have an employer, for example, domestic workers or some forms of street vendor, that relationship is not seen as being a standard relationship. And therefore, it's often not, these occupational health and safety laws and frameworks and policies often do not apply to them in the way that they would to someone else. in the formal economy. There's also the issue of workspaces. So we're talking about people whose workplaces, their places of work, are most often private homes, landfills, street corners, marketplaces, not offices, not necessarily factories, etc., or airports, So it's also about our idea of what is a workplace, what's a legitimate workplace. And in the eyes of many governments and in the eyes of many other entities, these places are not workplaces, and therefore these laws and policies, etc., should not apply.
Without proper support, informal workers are left vulnerable to crises, whether it's a public health emergency or the growing impacts of climate change.
So when you now add in the climate crisis, rising temperatures, heat waves, floods, droughts, etc., when you add in all of these climate crises, you then add more existential threats to workers. So you're just layering on more vulnerabilities on top of more vulnerabilities, and you're creating an environment and a condition where these existing vulnerabilities are then amplified.
The Philippines is among the countries most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. In fact, the World Bank estimates that by 2040, the country could face economic losses amounting to 13.6% of its gross domestic product or GDP because of these impacts. With such a looming threat, how can the Philippines safeguard its silent majority of workers from the worsening effects of climate change? More on this after a quick break. In a country as vulnerable to climate change as the Philippines, informal workers face heightened risks from climate-related events like floods, heat waves, and disease outbreaks. As climate change continues to endanger their lives and livelihoods, Christy Brem from WIGO emphasizes that governments can take a crucial first step, providing mechanisms to ensure informal workers have access to life-saving care.
Workers need to have access to occupational health services, which are tailored towards workers' occupations. So we know, for example, that if we have a good quality occupational health service, then a waste picker should be able to go and see a healthcare professional who understands that the illness or the injury that waste picker has come to see that healthcare professional for is because of the working conditions that they are facing on a landfill or whichever location where they're doing their waste picking work. Is to make that really important connection between the health issue and the working condition.
Beyond access to health services, the Philippines must also prioritize providing informal workers with some form of income protection. This would ensure that they can continue to support their families even when disasters like typhoons or health crises such as pandemics disrupt their livelihoods.
In the Philippines, we have what we so-called the Employees Compensation Program. We cover work-related injury and illnesses. We compensate the workers. But prior to that year, 2019, that program only covered workers in the formal sector. In 2019, we removed some legal barriers, and the Commission issued the Employees Compensation Commission, promulgated a resolution to cover workers in the informal economy who are, although there are still some limitation, members of the social security system. So in short, for purposes of compensating workers, whether you're employed in the informal or formal economy, if the injury or illness is work-related, the Philippine government, the Department of Labor and Employment, the Employees Compensation Commission covers the compensation.
That was Benjo Benavides, the country's Labor Undersecretary for Workers' Welfare and Protection, speaking at last year's Asia Pacific Social Protection Week. While the Philippines has programs like the Employees Compensation Program, Benavides admits that the Labor Department faces challenges in ensuring that aid reaches the people who need it most.
I recall during the pandemic, we also implemented the adjustment measure program that is meant to cover all workers, including the workers in the under informal employment. And we prioritize workers of micro enterprises. There was a point of that it was very difficult to implement the assistance. And that is one of the challenges that we encounter. One of the challenges is that the identification of the informal sector workers. Who are they and where are they? Once you identify their identity and their location, the next challenge that we encounter, how are we going to extend the assistance? The pandemic actually taught us that we need to exploit technology and digital solution.
Climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It directly affects the lives of informal workers who are already living on the edge. Building climate-resilient communities isn't only about investing in infrastructure. It's about creating systems and frameworks that safeguard the most vulnerable members of society.
So we see very often that workers are excluded from social insurance, which is linked to their incomes, which is linked to their employment, but also don't necessarily qualify for social assistance, which are targeted towards the poorest of the poor. And so this is why workers in the informal economy are often called the missing middle, because in a way they have too much. They're seen as having too much money to qualify for something that has, that's targeted towards the ultra poor, but also don't have enough money to actually be able to survive without some social protections in the form of insurance. So when there's a climate emergency event, whether that's a flood or a mudslide or a drought or a heat wave, workers should receive something that protects them from these added risks.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka. Again, I'm Tatiana Maligro. This episode was edited by Anthony Tobias and our executive producer is Jill Caro. Informal workers are the silent backbone of our economy and society. They have a huge potential to become bigger contributors, but only if we shield them from the health, social, and environmental risks. So I hope this episode encourages you to support our informal workers. And it would also mean a lot if you share this episode with someone who wants to support our informal economy. And of course, don't forget to follow Teka Teka on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. Thanks for listening.